Welcome to Midnight Mysteries. If you feel like listening to a horror story, you're in the right place. This evening, I will tell you a story that I have never told anyone before. Listen to it until the end, because only by listening until the end will you be able to give me your point of view. Just a few days ago, about a week if I remember correctly, I had accepted that job as the caretaker of the old cemetery in my village, which, for obvious reasons, I will not name in this story. And the evening I want to tell you about was my first night shift, and I couldn't have started this new job in a more unsettling way. I knew the stories surrounding that cemetery. They were the classic tales of apparitions and whispers in the dark, but I never thought I would find myself at the center of one of them. The evening air was cold and terribly damp, and a thin veil of fog covered the ground like a translucent blanket, deforming the shapes of the tombstones and making the paths within the complex almost indistinguishable from one another. My flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness, and I walked slowly among the graves with only the echo of my footsteps for company in that oppressive solitude. I was there at that precise moment because I had heard a loud noise coming from that area. Since it was the oldest part of the cemetery, I had been told that there had been collapses in the past, and in case of unusual noises, it was always advisable to check quickly to call the fire department to ensure the safety of the few visitors who frequented that area. Anyway, if you're interested, I'd say it's better to get back to my story. But first, let me remind you to like this story if you're enjoying it, leave a comment so we can interact, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Needless to say, how important all this is. Let's proceed. As I was saying, I was walking down one of the old paths and indeed noticed something unusual. A tomb was completely open. I didn't remember any scheduled works or recent burials in that section of the cemetery because, as I mentioned earlier, it was the oldest part of the entire complex. With my heart in my throat, I gathered my courage, and believe me, it takes a lot when you're alone, at night, in a cemetery, and I approached to investigate. The earth around the tombstone was fresh, as if someone had recently dug. I leaned over to look inside the open grave, but it was empty. There was nothing, not even a coffin. As I peered in, a gust of cold wind hit the back of my neck. It was as if someone, or something, had taken a deep breath right behind me. I turned abruptly, with my flashlight nervously dancing from right to left, but there was no one, just the shadows cast by the flashlight, graves, and bare trees silhouetted against the night sky, illuminated only by the faint light of the moon. At that moment, a long shiver ran down my spine, and for a moment, I confess that I thought of running away, but that's when I heard it. A low moan coming from the grave I had just moved away from. It was definitely a human moan, but it seemed laden with pain and anger. When I pointed the flashlight back at the tomb, I saw a spectral figure slowly rising from the darkness. And that's when, I confess, that, let's forget it, it's better. It was a translucent apparition with vaguely human contours and those eyes. Who could ever forget them? The eyes were as black as the night and stared at me as if they wanted to devour me. I couldn't move because I was paralyzed with fear. The figure moved towards me with a fluid and floating motion. I wanted to scream, but my voice, like my legs, was blocked, and the scream died in my throat. That's when I noticed other movements around me. Other tombs began to open, as if some incomprehensible signal had awakened the inhabitants of the cemetery. Figures similar to the first one began to emerge, slowly approaching until they almost surrounded me on three sides. Desperation finally gave me a jolt and managed to unlock my legs, propelling me through the only gap I had in front of me. I ran for my life among the graves, looking for an exit, a door, a gate, anything that would allow me to escape, but every direction seemed blocked by those spirits. The fog thickened, as did the shadows that multiplied, and the cold penetrated every fiber of my being. The apparitions surrounded me, and their moans filled the air. Exhausted, I tripped over a tree root and fell to the ground. At that point, those specters were instantly upon me with their faces twisted by that eternal suffering. I remember, as if it were yesterday, thinking that my end had come, when suddenly, a ray of light cut through the thick fog. It was dawn, bringing life to a new day. The figures began to dissolve, like snow in the sun, disappearing into the air along with their moans. Completely in shock, I dragged myself out of the cemetery, savoring the daylight that had never been so welcoming. With my last strength, I ran to my car, started it, and sped away without looking back, knowing I would never set foot in that cursed place again. I quit that very day, didn't need to think it over, and never, not for a moment, did I believe that night had been a figment of fatigue or my imagination. What I had experienced was the raw and naked reality, and I just had to accept it. Surely I could have told this story to someone else before today, but I am certain they would have said I was drunk or too tired and had dreamed it all. I am sure no one would ever have believed what I recounted, and that no one would have believed my story. But you believe me, don't you?